Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and I'm so delighted you've joined me this evening for a fabulous story. So before we get started, you go and get yourself something lovely to drink, and if it's something unusual, I'd love to know about it because I enjoy hearing from you. You are all like extended family to me and very special to me, so I love hearing from you, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, when Uncle Teddy died, it was tough on me and my mother. He was all the family we had left in the world, as the older generations in our family had long since passed away, uncles, aunts and grandparents. My family had a history of heart attacks, as if it was written in our DNA, as clearly as the writing in a book, with the ominous warning words promptly informing us that this is the way we would ultimately meet our end. But it wasn't anything to do with our DNA. We all unequivocally knew this. Put simply, it was down to the Sinclair family curse. One by one in our family, after people hit their 60th birthday, things went steadily downhill from thenceforth. We would lose our loved ones as fast as the plates being smashed at a Greek family wedding. Only a moment before, the family member would be fine, boasting excellent health, when suddenly they would clutch their chest, reach out for a wall to steady themselves, and then they would slough to the ground like a dry, crisp autumn leaf and float away in the wind in much the same way. It would seem my Uncle Teddy could not escape the wrath of this formidable, indiscriminate family curse, as 2 days after he turned 60, he was sitting at a watering hole in town, drinking a beer. Witnesses said he suddenly put down his beer, growing a pale white colour. He then clutched his chest, collapsing onto the floor in a crumpled heap. People were stunned when they realised he was dead. Now my mother, at 58 years old, was nervously waiting in the wings for her turn to come next, like standing reluctantly in the back of the queue, with butterflies flapping in your belly, to take a ride on a roller coaster. But only my mother did not want to take this ride, for there is no fun procured from being next in line to receiving the damning effects of the Sinclair family curse. Uncle Teddy's death was hard on us, me in particular, for after Uncle Teddy died, there was just me and my mother left. When she was gone, I would be orphaned in every sense of the word, with no surviving family members left on the entire planet, and that was a bitter pill to have to swallow. I would become like a lonely, barren wilderness, where rain never fell, and where the sun scorched the earth without apology, a soulless place that would only ever flower if I married and had children of my own. I had to consider the very real infelicious ramifications that the ill-omened Sinclair family curse could be cast upon my own children if they should be birthed into this world. Would they be afflicted by this harbinger of doom and fall under its weighty consequences? Let's not kid. My family had tirelessly visited specialists over the years, had regular checkups, endured all kinds of investigative medical procedures at their own expense, and nothing was ever wrong with them. There were no telltale arrows that pointed to heart disease, as you might expect, no thickening of the artery walls, arterial plaque, blockages, high blood pressure, or even cholesterol. Most of our family members at the time, that had long since died, had been informed by specialists that their hearts were in phenomenal condition. They had been given clean bills of health. Suffice to say, those medical assurances from the establishment never gave any of the Sinclair family a moment's peace. We instinctively knew that the Sinclair curse was surreptitiously waiting in the wings, like a furtive hired assassin who had marked our lives with a red X, who was waiting to strike us down when the hands of our biological clocks reached 60. Then, with their skillful hands on the trigger, they would blow our lives apart when we least suspected it, and no coroner in the country could explain our untimely deaths. My Uncle Ted thought it was a given that he would die at 60 years old, so he was prepared for the Sinclair family curse to afflict his life. Uncle Teddy believed that the sins of the fathers were passed down from generation to generation. He told us it was called karma. You can't avoid it. Eventually it comes back to bite you, and soon it'll be coming for me. The Sinclair family curse did not discriminate or even play favourites. It had ruthlessly taken down every single member of our family, without exception. The story began in 1884. An ancestor of ours, a man called Edwin Sinclair, was a masterful highway robber, with a ruthlessly cruel reputation that followed him. It was said he wore a black velvet cloak, lined with red silk, and wore a patch over his left eye. He rode a magnificent black stallion. He would lie in wait for his unsuspecting victims, deliberately causing the illustrious horses and carriages they were driving to become derailed. They belonged to people of great means, which held the beguiling promise of lining his pockets with bountiful gain, so he didn't waste a second to unleash his wrath upon them. Like a ghost in the dimming light of a fading day, when the shadows of darkness began to slowly fall, he'd pounce like a black panther onto the unexpected travellers from out the looming obscurity, where they would discern an ambiguous silhouette galloping towards them at breakneck speed on a magnificent black stallion. Things happened so speedily that no one reacted in time with any self-defence, for most were immediately frozen by an incapacitating fear. Edwin Sinclair dismantled their carriages. Wheels would come off and roll across the open prairies. He stole all their loot, usually leaving no witnesses behind. Without even an ounce of sober compassion, he'd plunge his large, razor-sharp knife straight into their hearts, one by one, while they begged for their lives. They would clutch their chests, keel over like limp rag dolls, flopping onto the ground and finally dying. It was said they would give Edwin this pleading look, as if they were saying, "Why would you do this to us?" Edwin had no mercy on any of these sorry people that he brutally attacked, for his insatiable greed was never satisfied, for a man who has wealth still never has enough, as the desire for more and more and more becomes like an itch that needs to be scratched. Let's just say the horses, the goods, the money, the gold and jewellery were greedily snatched by Edwin, who was so savage he'd cut off the dead people's fingers if he couldn't remove the rings they wore. People would know the signature of this highway robber, as missing fingers on the victims of these attacks became commonplace. Edwin grew very rich from his exploitation of the well-heeled travellers on the road, who never saw him coming, and even if they did, they seemed incapable of reacting in time with any form of self-defence. Some say Edwin began to enjoy the life of a one-eyed bandit, so after he turned 60 years old, which was a long life for many people in the 1800s, he collapsed on a street corner, clutching his chest and dying at once. Uncle Teddy believed the weight of what Edwin Sinclair had done all those years ago, the cruel, savage way he had killed his victims, had left an indelible imprint on generations of the family bloodline, where the karmic debt would need to be paid back in full for the lives that had been so callously lost. When we reached 60 years old, much like the awful moment when Edwin plunged the knife into the hearts of his innocent victims, members of my own family would likewise experience the powerful force of an invisible blade piercing through their hearts so viciously, to replicate what Edwin Sinclair had done those many years ago to all his sorry victims who were now extracting their ultimate revenge on the highwayman's family bloodline. I often wondered how many of us would have to die this way when we finally turned 60 years old, before the karmic debt was finally settled. Of course, if we told people about our family curse, no one would believe a word of it. Life didn't work out like that, they would say. But they had no idea what they were talking about. Similar curses were found all around the world, even in ancient Egypt, when tombs of the pharaohs were disturbed. It was claimed, whether archaeologist or grave robber, anyone who entered the tomb was afflicted with the curse of death, illness, and extreme bad luck. By all accounts, even after the autopsy on my Uncle Teddy, that my mother had arranged to seek answers to our many questions as to why he died, the coroner's words confirmed our very worst fears. "I do not know what caused Mr. Sinclair's death," my mother had been told. "I found nothing to explain why his heart suddenly stopped. Your brother's death is an enigmatic mystery that makes no sense at all. There is no rational physical explanation as to why he died so suddenly. But when I did examine his heart, it was in perfect condition. But there was a peculiar mark on his heart that looked suspiciously like a stab wound, but it hadn't been pierced. It was more like a birthmark of some kind. Profoundly odd. Never seen anything like it before. His death is a medical mystery. It's unexplained. I would describe it as adult sudden death syndrome. You see, Cat, my mother told me, it's the same with every single Sinclair death. The very same birthmark is described every time on every one of our family members' hearts. I mean, what are the chances of that? It's the spiritual marking of Edwin Sinclair's sharp blade. These coroners can never give us a reasonable explanation as to why anybody dies in our family. I'll be the next in line, my mother told me. I've got 2 years left to go, and then I'll be a goner like the rest of them. She spoke with a resigned acceptance, like someone who's had a cancer diagnosis and has been told they've only got 2 years left to live. Nonsense! You're going to live a long time, I told my mother, my heart heavy, knowing that her stabbing words were profoundly true. I had prayed tirelessly that the karmic debt could be lifted and forgiven. Why should we be responsible for what Edwin Sinclair did so long ago? I was sorry for the unfortunate victims of his violence. I was sure my desperate pleas to God for our transgressions to be forgiven had fallen on deaf ears, and that God was not listening. It wasn't easy living with the looming dark shadow like this cast over our lives. But my optimistic Uncle Teddy would make light of it. 60's not too bad an innings. It could be a lot worse. And let's face it, we all have to die sometime, don't we? I knew he was right, of course, but in my heart I rued the day that Edwin Sinclair had ever been born, thanks to the chaotic pandemonium he'd left behind him after he drew his very last breath. Uncle Teddy had never been married. He seemed to enjoy living the reclusive single life, although he was by no means a reticent, retiring or shrinking character. On the contrary, he was larger than life, dynamic, colourful, effervescent, a charming, bubbly person, as fun as a bottle of French champagne. The locals in town adored him. He always brought smiles to people's faces and was a breath of fresh air to the community that made the world a richer place for having known him. Uncle Teddy did not conform. He didn't fit into any slot. Everything about him was unique. My mother said that even as a child on the beach, Uncle Teddy had rejected the traditional bucket and spade that every other kid was using to make sand castles on the beach. From a young age, he'd do things differently. That was who he was. He'd come to the beach with some of my grandmother's cake moulds and design his very own individualistic castles in the sand. Uncle Teddy adored the home he had designed and created ingeniously, with the help of an avant-garde architect, which he painted in a bright purple colour that he called the castle. He always said that a man's home is his castle, hence the name Castle was born. I had enjoyed spending much of my childhood at the castle, where it was just me, my mother, and my Uncle Teddy. The castle was an architect's idiosyncratic creation that poked fun at classic symmetrical designs and failed exponentially to conform to the status quo, or even the traditional stereotypes of your prescriptively average home that was methodically designed to be harmoniously uniform and pleasing to the eye. The castle was like a loud, almost rude piece of contemporary artwork that would disturb your senses, poke fun at the rigid, stiff, regimental sequences of conventional house design, and laugh in the face of the structured, systematic way of doing things. The castle was unorthodox, beyond the realms of what you would consider proverbial architecture. When you first saw it, your eyes would likely pop out of your sockets and your mouth drop wide open, and you would possibly say, "What the hell?" The castle embraced the word different with a swaggering, haughty pride, as if it knew that it was special, individualistic, eccentric, one of a kind, for there was no other house quite like it anywhere, and that was the whole point of it. My Uncle Teddy wanted to live in a house like no other. The castle proudly boasted windows of all shapes and sizes, quirky arched corridors, high ceilings, huge open fireplaces, interesting nooks and crannies, but the pièce de résistance was the towering watchtower, which rose up on the side of the house like a purple lighthouse, where you could exhaust yourself climbing up the narrow wrought-iron winding staircase that never seemed to come to an end. It was in this very special place that you were privileged to view the countryside for miles around and be inspired by its prepossessing, arresting views, where you could see the viridescent undulating valleys, Uncle Teddy's black and bay American horses frolicking happily in the pastures, and the tall lofty trees of the woodgrove that sprawled out over many miles, along with the distant hazy silhouettes of the mountains. Ostensibly, Uncle Teddy, who rebelliously spit on the world's stiff-necked, punctilious way of doing things, would never conform to regular fashion. He would always wear bright, colourful paisley jackets, scarves and pants, and eclectic glasses in a plethora of geometric shapes and colours, so everyone could see him coming, for there was nothing tame about my unbridled uncle, who was loved by so many because of his differences. When I was growing up, there were whispers around town that Uncle Teddy was asexual, as he had no interest in forming any long-lasting intimate relationships with either sex, whether it be male or female. He possibly had zero sex drive, but he had friends by the bucket-load, as everyone appreciated his eccentricities and his very infectious sense of humour, which would make many people double over with laughter. I guess you could say the castle superbly mirrored my uncle's unique individuality, and for that reason alone I loved the place with all my heart, as it was the quintessential reflection of Uncle Teddy's gregarious, flamboyant personality. Me and my mother were sharing an apartment in Manhattan together, when we were unfortunately informed of Uncle Teddy's tragic passing. We had not visited the castle for many long years, as Uncle Teddy regularly came up to New York instead, to stay with us sometimes for weeks at a time, and to enjoy fabulous shopping trips to Macy's. Sometimes we went off on holidays together, the three of us, to exotic locations around the globe, often financed by Uncle Teddy, who was generous to a fault. Me and my mother were particularly close, as my dad had died when I was only 4 years old, from a pulmonary embolism, after taking a long-haul flight from America to the other end of the world. But as to where that was, I cannot remember, nor can my mother. After Uncle Teddy's funeral, we decided to remain at the castle indefinitely, to sort out through some of his stuff. He had a rare collection of books and priceless artifacts that he had collected over the years, from his exciting travels around the world, so we couldn't just throw everything out. We had to sift through it all with a fine tooth comb, in case we stumbled on anything of value. My mother believed we could tone down the castle, remove the lurid bright purple paint, so that the property became more desirable to more avant-garde property buyers who were looking for something a little different. It would not be an easy house to sell, but the purple colour might scare some potential buyers off. "You just need the right buyer, Mrs. Crawley," my mother was told by the estate agent Philip Meyer, who thought the castle was absolutely magnificent. "If you paint the castle white, or a very attractive off-cream colour, it could be exceedingly appealing, and the property itself, with its large expanse of land, rolling hills and sumptuous wood groves, is a buyer's dream." So it was decided after much deliberation that me and my mother would spend the next 3 months sorting out the castle. We would move in there for a while. I will admit I had mixed reservations about returning to Uncle Teddy's rural town, where I hoped I'd never run into the likes of Louisa Farrell ever again, for there was a raw history between us that had soured our once perfect childhood friendship. I couldn't forget or forgive what she did that fateful day, all those years ago. The possibility of running into her in town left my hackles rising, but I assured myself that maybe she had married and long since left town, and that thought consoled me greatly, for I clandestinely hoped I'd never ever lay eyes on her again. But little did I know that my hopes would be dashed, and Louisa would tarnish the canvas of my life by reappearing like a broken-down cuckoo clock that one day suddenly works, and out comes the cuckoo. No one knew why the two of us had fallen out, and they never would know, for some secrets have a tight lid on them, like a bug you might put into a mason jar with holes at the top that no one can unscrew. It would seem our secret was one of those cloak and dagger ones that no one would ever know about, not even my mother or Uncle Teddy, when he was alive. I could never bring myself to tell anyone what had happened to me that fateful, inauspicious day. It was far too distressing and upsetting, and it hurt too much to talk about. I remember I first met Louisa when she was trespassing on our land, having accessed our property through one of the woodland trails at the rear. She lived in the farmhouse next to Uncle Teddy's. Let's just say a bird on the wind had told her a young girl of similar age to herself had moved into the farmhouse next door to hers, and that thought had brought a glimmer of hope into her otherwise monotone life. Louisa had been a late lamb in her family, an unexpected child that arrived serendipitously, with no advance warning. It would seem her older siblings had long since left home, and so for a young girl in a farmhouse all alone, who found the company of her very regimental, stiff-necked parents ridiculously mundane and stifling, she was eager to meet me, in the hope that we might soon become solid friends. She had liked the castle the moment it had been erected, as the allure of my Uncle Teddy's home represented for her a bright colour on a dull page of grey paper that grabbed your attention and generously offered you the promise of something that smelt distinctly like excitement, a certain breakaway from the monotonously dull, predictable certainty of everyday life, as she had known it back then. I remember the day I saw her, a startling bright flash of white peeking at me from behind the tree in our woodgrove. I was sitting on the steps of the front porch at the time, enjoying the feel of the sun caressing my shoulders with its congenial warmth. I was wearing some rather snazzy denim shorts, a pretty pink t-shirt with lacy sleeves and pearly buttons down the middle, along with a strappy pair of diamante sandals that glittered like gold on my feet, a gift from my Uncle Teddy, who could not resist buying anything sparkly. He was like a magpie in that regard. My mother and Uncle Teddy were incredibly close. On this occasion they were chatting away in the kitchen garrulously. I could hear the sing-song expressive dramatic overtones of my uncle's theatrical voice. "Oh, my darling," he'd say to my mother, "you should see what Mrs. Shapiro was wearing in town today. That woman is so dreadfully dull. I swear to you, grey and white is the sum total of her washed-out wardrobe. The poor woman was mortified by my dream coat of bright colours that I wore to town today. I think she was getting blind-sighted by all the colour staring her in the face. She told me that I looked like a parrot. I sensed she was not being complimentary to me when she said that." He laughed. You could hear the tinkle of my mother's laughter. "I don't blame her, Teddy. You and your colour. You're bound to be quite terrifying to a tamed woman like that, whose life is so predictably monochromatic, and you come along with your blazing colours to upset the scenery. It's got to be a shock for a woman like that." "Well, in that case, remind me never to invite the woman over to the castle for dinner. She might have a heart attack if she saw that I painted it bright purple." "I'm sure she's heard about it by now," said my mother. "The castle is the talk of the town. No property like it anywhere." I was absent-mindedly shelling peas on the porch, and the reflectant white of what seemed like a dress or shirt that I'd seen peeking at me from behind the tree had caught my immediate attention. What was that? Was someone watching me, I wondered? My childlike curiosity was tickled. I promptly put my bowl of shelled peas down on the step and went to investigate the strange anomaly. That was the first time I ever laid eyes on Louisa. I was 10 at the time. "Hello there. What's your name?" "I'm Louisa," she said shyly. "I live in the farmhouse next door." "Oh," I said, looking surprised. "Well, why were you hiding from me?" "I don't know," she said. "I guess I'm shy. I just wanted to see if it was true that somebody my age was living next door." "If you like," I said, "you can help me shell peas, and then we can play together." Her face had lighted up like a Christmas tree. "You're nice," she said. "I never thought you would be nice. My dad says people from New York can be very stuck up and full of themselves." From that moment on, Louisa and I had become inseparable, until one day, 5 years later, Something went terribly wrong, and all these years later, the memory of that day could potentially make me break out in hives, as me and Louisa had never spoken to each other since. So 15 years later, when me and my mother had arrived back in town, I was doing a food shop. I scanned the aisles of the supermarket, dropping the items me and my mother needed into a trolley. You know the sort of things: loo rolls, shampoo, soap, flour, butter, sugar, tea bags. The list goes on. I industriously beavered my way towards the shortest queue that I could find, my trolley heavily weighted down with an excess of shopping that made me look as if I had a family of 12 hungry kids to feed back at home. I was concerned over the shopping in my cart, my eyes hovering over everything to ensure I hadn't forgotten something. That was when I barely noticed the skinny woman standing in front of me. She was wearing a dark green coat and busy hoisting large containers of milk onto the counter. I barely even glanced up at her, as I was preoccupied by the list of things I needed to do, that unrolled in my mind like lengthy scrolls. I would possibly have not recognized her at all if it hadn't been for the pointed shape of her nose and the familiar sweep of her very distinctive brown chestnut hair that was held back in a ponytail with a velvety black ribbon that I would have recognized anywhere. That was how Louisa had done her hair 15 years prior, and her hairstyle had not changed much. Surely not, I thought, staring disbelievingly at the woman. It can't be her, I thought. It can't be. I watched as the woman's arms offloaded bottles of peanut butter, chicken breasts, potatoes and Coca-Cola. And it was only when the job was complete she happened to briefly glance up in my direction. At first her skimming was brief, but then she held my gaze, and her eyes widened. I could swear she looked frightened, as I'm sure her memories of our last time spent together leapt into her mind like an obnoxious bad smell she didn't want to remember. I felt as though electric currents were spiralling up and down my body. My skin began to crawl, as if I'd been attacked by a hive of red ants. I stood there gawking at her for a moment. It was as if there was a huge gulf between the two of us, and we were staring at each other from opposite sides of the globe, with only a stiff, unyielding silence between us. But that was soon broken when Louisa's lips quivered and she finally said, "Oh, Cat, how nice to see you. I would have recognized you anywhere. You haven't changed at all. I had no idea you were back in town." I tried to smile warmly at the woman, whom had once been my best friend, but try as I might, the elastic tug of my lips refused to oblige, as memories of what Louisa had done that day, all those years ago, came flooding back like a cruel reminder. It was hard not to hate her. There was a huge part of me that wanted to lash out at her and extract my revenge, but instead I remained stoically still. "I'm back for 3 months or so. With my mother. We're staying at Uncle Teddy's house. He died, you know." "I know. Very sad. Many people in town were very devastated. He was quite the character, wasn't he?" "That he was." "How have you been?" I asked. Of course I had no interest in how Louisa was. I couldn't have cared a brass farthing, but sometimes out of pure politeness, asking someone how they are is what naturally tumbles out of your mouth, as it did mine, without restraint. She cocked her head and said, "Oh, you know, I have my good days and bad. I have an autistic child. He can be hard work. It's difficult at times." "I'm sorry," I said, rather shocked that Louisa was being so candid with me, as if for once she was actually wearing her heart on her sleeve. I'd always known her to be unforthcoming and very secretive as a young girl, and getting anything out of her had always been like extracting blood from a stone. "Oh, don't be," she said. "It is what it is." She released a heavy sigh. "We have to take what the world throws at us, don't we? And sometimes it's not terribly pretty." Was that a barb aimed at me, I wondered? As if surreptitiously buried beneath her cloak and dagger words was a clandestine message, especially for me, spoken with silent, inaudible words. "It happened. Get over it. You overreacted at the time. You were the one that blew our friendship up, not me." I nodded my head in agreement. "You're right. Life can be tough." "You can say that again," she said. "So you're here to sell the castle, is that right?" "Something like that," I said. Louisa raised an eyebrow and managed an insolent smirk. Well, that's not going to be easy, is it? Most people don't want to buy a bright purple house, do they? The spiked jabs of her discourteous words and insinuations pierced me hard. Was there any need to be so presumptuously rude, so disrespectful and unkind? I thought you liked the castle, I said defensively. You said you liked it as a child. You liked how it didn't conform to stereotypes. I lied. You have to admit it. It was way too over the top. I mean, come on. Who lives in a mansion with a watchtower? She smirked in a condescending tone that made my blood boil. In that moment I wanted to pounce on Louisa like a black panther and go for the jugular, but I resisted and managed a stiff, watery smile. Louisa opened her large brown leather bag, pulling out a green wallet. She fumbled inside for her credit card, which she presented to the cashier, a young woman in her early 20s with short-cropped brown hair, done in a pixie-style haircut, and large blue eyes heavily lined with black coal pencil. She was blowing bubbles with her bubble gum and looked incredibly bored. She took Louisa's credit card, running it through her system, and then finally handed it back to her, with a very disinterested look on her face. "Well, good luck," said Louisa, turning to me briefly for a second, with a churlish, rather triumphant look on her face. "I think you're going to need it, trying to sell that eyesore of a place. I'm glad I'm not in your shoes, that's all." I could not believe she'd actually said that to me. She hadn't changed after all these years. Her icy cold heart had not managed to defrost or thaw, like the old turkey at the bottom of your freezer, that is as solid as a cement brick. "It's good to see you again, Cat. I'm sure I'll see you around." There was a smug, self-satisfied look in her eyes as she marched off defiantly with her trolley, as if she'd thoroughly enjoyed plunging a dagger into my heart and seeing me squirm like an octopus at the end of a fisherman's spear. I think she got exactly what she wanted, because I did squirm. Louisa didn't care about hurting me, like she'd done all those years ago. It was clear to me she'd only cared about one person, and that was herself. Things had not changed in that regard. You would think after 15 years of not seeing each other, the woman would have mellowed, and an autistic child would have softened some of her hard edges, made her into a more compassionate human being. But it seemed that she remained as heartless as ever. So there you are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.